Okay, I guess let's just get into it. So what is
All right.
okay, actually first I should ask you what your name is. Tell me your name and where
My
you're
name is
from.
Miranda. Oh, okay. My name is Miranda Bissell. I'm from LeClaire, Iowa.
And what is the Queens of the Damned horror cast?
It is basically just three women sitting around talking about anything involving the horror genre. We talk about horror movies, true crime, pretty much anything that comes to mind when you think of the horror genre.
So this includes movies, books, unsolved crimes, like just everything, all forms of media.
Yep, pretty much anything that you can think of. We just recently did an episode on Charles Manson, which was interesting. And it's definitely not something that you normally see with a horror podcast, but we're trying to kind of expand those horizons a little bit.
And so how did this start?
It all actually started with a woman here in the Quad Cities. I actually don't know her personally, but she wanted to start a magazine that's all done by women, and I think it comes out every 2 months. I don't know if it started or not, but that's how it all came about. Nikki, one of the girls, knew about it, and she got a hold of me and added me to the group, and that's pretty much how it was started. She kind of got a hold of me and asked if I wanted to do this. It was something that I had been wanting to do for a while, and it just sort of grew from there. It took a couple months, but we're finally getting moving on it.
And so talk a little bit more, you mentioned expanding horizons earlier. So what makes you guys different from other podcasts that talk about the horror genre?
Well, I think a lot of podcasts kind of look at horror at its most basic level, just, basically what you see when you watch movies. But because we are, all three of us are very involved in the genre as a platform, we're involved in all levels of it. So intellectually, we look at everything. We look at characters. We look at plot. We look at how society sees this and how it all affects society. And it's, I would say, more of like an intellectual look at horror, along with what you see in other horror podcasts too. So, there's some things that you just can't explain in the horror genre that just is what it is, and there are other things that can be explained. And so we try to cover all bases there.
Can you give me a quick example of something that can't be explained versus something that can be explained?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm a prime example of that. There are some, like, my favorite horror movies can be explained. The things that scare me the most are representative of my anxieties in real life. The things that scare me the most are movies involving exorcisms. And I am somebody who is terrified of a loss of control, and that's something that we talk about in our first episode, how those fears kind of showcase themselves in the horror movies that we enjoy. But there are other things that can't be explained about me. Like, I just enjoy weird things. It's not something that relates to anything about my life. I just enjoy the blood, the guts, the gross stuff about it. And it's a little weird, but it's just, there's things about the horror genre that just, it is what it is, and it can't be explained, but people love it.
And so why do you want to tell the world about the horror genre? What's the point?
Well, I think it's extremely misunderstood in our culture. We kind of look at horror as something that is lower class, that people who aren't intelligent are the ones who enjoy it. And I really want to prove to the world that that's not necessarily true, that there are very intelligent people who look at horror for more than what society sees it as. It has a lot of links to psychology and just our lives in general. I mean, it really showcases a lot of the issues that we face in our society. I think it's just extremely misunderstood in our culture, and it's becoming more popular, but I think it needs to be more understood. And, a lot of people look at horror as something very anti-feminist, and I think one of our goals as well is to prove that it's not really an anti-feminist genre, that it actually can be a feminist genre in many different ways.
And so you talk about how, it's misunderstood, and that links with something that I know about you. You have a tattoo on your shoulder that is a Wes Craven quote. Can you tell us real quick what that quote is?
Horror films don't create fear, they release it.
And so can you explain a little bit about what that means to you? What does that mean that they don't create fear, they release it? What does that mean?
Well, I'm a strong believer that horror movies, just like what the quote says, I mean, horror movies really don't develop fears within us. And if you kind of look at psychoanalysis created by Sigmund Freud, he believed that we have these deep fears within our unconscious that we aren't aware of, and they're represented through symbols. And there are so many symbols that follow us throughout our lives that we see in all forms of art that we don't, I mean, how do you know where they come from? Everybody knows what they represent, but sometimes we don't even know where they even came from. And we see a lot of this in horror movies. We see symbolism that is not directly in your face. You don't necessarily know exactly what it means until you sit there and you look at it for a while. So when you're watching horror movies, you're not creating these fears. They're not developing anything within you. You already have your fears developed. It's just when you watch horror movies and you're reacting to them, you're reacting to something else within you. You are releasing those anxieties that you don't fully understand because you're seeing them in a form that isn't directly affecting you. And it's letting that fear go. One of the great things about horror movies for me is that I'm somebody who has a lot of anxieties. And I know that when I'm sitting there and I'm watching these movies and that my anxieties are being represented, that I do feel a kind of freedom. You do feel that fear, but it's not exactly like a fear that something's going to happen to you. It's more of a loss of something, like something is being released. It's a different kind of fear than when you're being placed in a situation. So I don't prescribe to the belief that horror films make people violent. I know there are a lot of studies out there that video games make people violent, so I won't, talk about that. But, I really think that horror movies are more of a catharsis than anything. They don't develop anything within us. They just let all of those anxieties go that are being trapped inside of our minds.